Ready?
That's bon appetit.
Hi everyone, I'm Yael Aronoff. I direct the Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel, and I teach here at James Madison College International Relations. We know this has been an incredibly difficult and heartbreaking few days for so many, several different communities. And so we especially, we had planned this so much in advance, but we especially think it's important at this time to really come together and have constructive conversation and look at different perspectives and connections to Jerusalem, futures for Jerusalem. We'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions, and you can welcome to ask anything you'd like. So as many of you know, on Saturday morning, Hamas attacked and targeted Israeli civilians. There are up to 1,000 that died. And in terms of the population of Israel, it's like, you could argue 10 9/11s, and that would be like 25,000 Americans being citizens and civilians being targeted. And our heart goes out to them and the pain the communities at MSU are also feeling that are connected with friends and family there. Our heart goes out to Palestinian civilians that are suffering and dying right now, several hundred, and the numbers are growing in terms of the response, and I'm also, and we're fearful of kind of the human casualties, and we might get into politics on the panel or in questions and answers, but mainly we want to reach out at a human level to make sure that we all at MSU feel compassion and respect for our Jewish, Israeli, Palestinian community members and how deeply affected they are in different ways. And we kind of wanted to model ourselves constructive, dialogue in this painful situation and help guide a discussion where everybody feels safe and open to express their feelings, to ask critical questions, but that we're doing it in a respectful way that really respects the human toll, right, that are affecting all these different communities. And I think in that vein, if you don't mind, if we take a minute of silence to really think about all the human casualties and people who have been killed just in the past 3 days. And what most Israelis and Palestinians, what we all really yearn for, is peace. So it may not happen tomorrow, but we're all want to respect the fact that that's really what ultimately the vast majority of both populations want. And so I'm so thrilled that you came and joined us, particularly at this moment.
Thank you, Professor Aronoff. Thank you, everyone, for coming today and being together. My name is Dr. Weiss. I'm the Sterling Israeli Visiting Scholar and the Israel Institute Teaching Fellow here at the Michael and Elaine Sterling.
Institute for Jewish Studies. It's been a hard few days.
It has been a hard few days.
None of us have slept in the last few days. I'm sure many of you haven't.
It is my honor to introduce Dr. Yael Aronoff, the director of the Michael and Elaine Sterling Institute for Jewish Studies and Modern Israel here at Michigan State University. Professor Aronoff is the Chair of Israel Studies and is Professor of International Relations in James Madison College at MSU, here at MSU, and her published books are The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers, When Hardliners Opt for Peace and Continuity, and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond, co-edited with Ilan Peleg and Saliba Sarsar. It is also my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. Mohamed Ghumrawi, who is visiting assistant teaching professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University, FIU, in Miami, Florida. He's also Associate Director of the Muhsin and Fawza Jafar Center for Muslim World Studies at FIU. His research interests include Palestinian-Israeli relations, the Palestinian diaspora, geopolitics of the Middle East, nation building and state formation, conflict resolution, and peace studies.
So, and welcome, Professor Ghumrawi. I also wanted to welcome Professor Saliba Sarsar, and I wanted to introduce him just because we've known each other for 50 years, I think now, most of my life, and we've worked together. So it's a real pleasure to have both of you, especially at this time, and you, Saliba. Professor Sarsar is a professor at Monmouth College of Political Science, Monmouth University, I'm so sorry, and president and CEO of the Jerusalem Peace Institute. For the past couple of years, from 2022 to 2024, he's been at Princeton University School of Public International Affairs. I think part of the work he's doing is working on different frameworks for confederation as possible solutions for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he came here to James Madison College a year ago with fellow Israeli-Palestinian drafters of that particular framework for a solution. His most recently authored Peace Building in Israeli-Palestinian Relations, he wrote and talked about in my senior seminar today, and he also spoke with Veved's class, so they've, have a full day that they've been doing with us. He also edited and co-edited the 3 volumes that really form the basis for this panel about what Jerusalem means from Christian perspectives, Muslim perspectives, and Jewish perspectives, and the connections between all 3, and he'll talk a little bit about that as a frame for our panel today. His most recent coded books are Inequality and Governance in an Uncertain World, Democracy in Crisis Around the World, and that we did together, Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond. He's won numerous awards, so we don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll name just a few. The recipient of the Award of Academic Excellence from the American Task Force on Palestine, the Humanitarian Award from the National Conference for Community and Justice, and the Holy Land Christian Ecumenical Foundation Award. So I find this inspiring to have this dialogue with you today, and we really extend a warm welcome to you. And so I think Professor Sarsar is going to go last, actually.
I'm going to go last.
He loves going last in these things. And I think you're going to go first?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, yeah.
Oh, I just want to quickly thank the co-sponsors, James Madison College, the College of Arts and Letters, the College of Social Science, the Residential College of the Arts and Humanities, the International Studies Programs, the Office of Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, the Asian Studies Center, the Peace and Justice Program, the Department of Religious Studies, the Department of Political Science. So we thank all our co-sponsors and support from across the university.
Excellent. Yeah, well, first and foremost, thank you to Professor Weiss and Professor Aronoff to inviting us here, and of course the Serlian Institute and Professor Sarsar for joining us. And I really appreciate the invitation and to be here at MSU and to speak with you all today. So, of course, in light of the recent events and the outbursts of recent violence that we've seen in the region, of course, you can imagine as we planned this event, we did not suspect that this outburst would happen in the region. And I'm sure we can discuss it more as we get to the Q&A and discussion. But initially, when I was invited here, I was asked to speak on Jerusalem and the importance of Jerusalem to not only the 3 monotheistic religions, but also the importance of Jerusalem within the Islamic faith in particular. And as we wrote this volume of books, I obviously published an article in the Muslim Perspectives volume. And so when we look at Jerusalem, it holds a significance to the three major Abrahamic faith traditions. And ultimately, even though we might worship in a different way, we might pray in a different way, we might call ourselves or place ourselves into different categories, ultimately, being part of a monotheistic religion, Jerusalem is really the epicenter and of how all three faiths practice. We're all ultimately praying to a single God, right? And no matter the form that we do that in. And if we look at Jerusalem, of course, in Judaism, it's an extremely important city. It's the city where the first and second Jewish temples were both built. It was where both were destroyed, the second temple being destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. It is the place where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is built, and this is the land where Jesus Christ was crucified, Jesus was resurrected, and most importantly, not most importantly, I'm sorry, but for Muslims as well, it's the place where Prophet Muhammad had his night journey and ascension into heaven, or what we call in Arabic, Laylat al-Isra and Miraj. And so when we look at Jerusalem, we can sort of see this duality in the narrative of how we approach Jerusalem. Of course, salam, meaning peace, right? Shalom, meaning peace in Arabic, very similar words. And we like to emphasize the loving nature of Jerusalem. It's this special place, this beautiful place, this holy place. But there is a duality, right, when we look at Jerusalem as well. It's a place of one of the most sought after pieces of land in the world, as well as throughout history. There's been wars, conquest, natural events, natural disasters such as earthquakes. And so it really has this interesting duality when we try to talk about Jerusalem. In terms of the Islamic faith and the importance of Jerusalem to Muslims in particular, in the Quran, Jerusalem is mentioned about 70 times, either directly or indirectly. It's also mentioned as the place where all the different prophets from Prophet Muhammad and the prophets before him, Abraham, Jesus, all roamed, walked, lived. And the Prophet Muhammad, during his time and when he lived, it was the first Qibla, or direction of prayer for Muslims. And so just as Jews still pray towards Jerusalem today, at the beginning of Islam, Muslims also pray towards Jerusalem, until this would later be changed by an injunction by God that instructed the Prophet Muhammad to tell Muslims to change their direction of prayer towards the Kaaba, which is in Mecca today, or modern-day Saudi Arabia. So two of the most important stories for Muslims in regards to Jerusalem is the Laylat al-Miraj and Laylat al-Isra and Miraj. And the Laylat al-Isra is the first part of the tradition that says that the Prophet Muhammad rode on al-Buraq, which is this sort of magical horse in the Islamic tradition. Imagine a horse with wings on it. You see a lot of this in Greek mythology as well. And so the Prophet Muhammad rode al-Buraq from Mecca to Jerusalem in a single night. And when he arrived in Jerusalem, it said that he led all the previous prophets in prayer, from Prophet Moses, Abraham, Noah, etc. And then from there he was ascended into heaven. The al-Miraj part, he ascended into the heavens, where he was able to meet the different prophets, and then he was given instructions by God or Allah on instructions for Muslims on prayer, and where Muslims were instructed to pray 5 times a day. Now, this is the importance of Jerusalem actually during the time of the Prophet Muhammad as he lived. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in around 632 CE, there are 4 caliphs or caliphs. They are called the Rashidun, or the rightly guided caliphs, that sort of lead the Muslim ummah or Muslim community after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. I'll focus, the four are Abu Bakr, Omar ibn al-Khattab, Uthman, and Ali. I'll focus on the second Khalif, which is Omar ibn al-Khattab, and I'll refer to him as Omar moving forward. And Omar is ultimately the Khalif that conquers Jerusalem for the Muslims. This is the first Muslim conquest of the city of Jerusalem. And this happens in about the year 637, 638 CE. Some scholars argue about the exact date, but we'll say around 637, 638. And so the city of Jerusalem was laid under siege by the Muslim armies, and the patriarch Sophronius refused to surrender the city of Jerusalem unless it was to Omar personally. And so when Omar received this message in Damascus, he then traveled to Jerusalem to receive the city. The patriarch Sophronius came and brought Omar from outside of the gates and inside of the old city, and he began to tour Omar of the old city. And during this tour, he took them into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And while he was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the adhan for Dhuhr prayer, or afternoon prayer, went off. And the patriarch invited Omar to pray inside of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, Omar refused. And when asked by the patriarch, why don't you want to pray in here? He said, if I pray in here and Muslims break the treaty that we have signed here today, that I fear that Muslims will either turn the church into a mosque or that they will destroy the church and build a mosque over it. And so Omar walked out of the church. The tradition has it that he threw a stone as far as he could, and where the stone landed is where he prayed. So he essentially walked out of the doors of the church and he prayed just outside of the doors. And for anyone who's traveled to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or if you've been to Jerusalem today, just outside of the doors of the church, there is erected a mosque there today called the Omar Mosque. So the reason I like to tell this story is because I think it shows the respect of religions. And within Islam, Jews and Christians are both considered people of the book who worship the same God as Muslims do. And so you can kind of see from the initial conquests of the city by Muslims this respect for the other religions that inhabited the region prior to it. Now, this treaty that Omar signed with the patriarch called for civil and religious liberties for Christians, but it also, for Jews that lived on the hinterlands of Jerusalem, Omar actually allowed the Jews to return to the old city of Jerusalem. Before then, Jews were actually expelled from the city under the Romans. So the Jews saw this as the end of the Roman rule of the city. And they were also able to come back into the old city of Jerusalem and live, peacefully, mostly peacefully. I'm not to say that there was different issues along the way, but mostly peacefully under Muslim rule at this time. So from this period on, you would see Jerusalem more or less stay under Muslim rule throughout the different empires all the way until, and of course there were brief periods such as the Crusades where Christians would rule the city. But more or less it stayed under Muslim rule until the end of the Ottoman Empire and World War I. And then you had the British Mandate, and then ultimately the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan from 1948 until 67. And then after 67, you have Israel that takes over the East Jerusalem and the Old City. And that sort of leaves us where we are today. Now in terms of current political dynamics of the city, you sort of have two dual narratives that we are seeing play out in the city. One is, of course, the equality for all religions to be able to access the city, to be able to pray in the city freely, regardless of their race or religion or background. Of course, Jerusalem is a place where tons of international tourists travel every year. But then on the other hand, you have a lot of difficulties that we see in the city, and this happens to be, really the reality of one of the narrative that's calling for or sort of propagates an exclusivity to the city. And so this creates really a very tense situation of the inhabitants of the city. And I think I'll sort of leave it there, and we can discuss more as we get to Q&A
Great.
and discussion.
Thank you so much. So I'm just quickly looking at the clock, and you'll keep me if I talk too long. When Professor Sarsar asked me to contribute to this volume, he said, oh, you can also make it kind of personal as well. And so I have the unacademic title of my favorite city, Jerusalem, my favorite city in the world. So I'll talk a little bit about, with all three religions, there's the historical kind of religious connections and so forth, but there's also kind of understanding the diversity of Christians, Muslims, and Jews and how they are connected to Jerusalem in different ways and how they feel about it and how they're connected today beyond kind of and intertwined with that history. And so I have lived in Jerusalem for 3 years and in other parts before then, and have brought MSU students on 4 different study abroads to Jerusalem. And so I feel deeply connected to the city. But first I'll talk a little bit about the Jewish connection, and we only have time to do a surface level of that. But of course, as was mentioned, you have in King David's time, in the 9th century BCE, there's kind of sovereignty, and it was the capital of his kingdom, right? So you had a sovereignty, and this will have all kinds of repercussions for now too, of a political sovereignty just at that time as well. And then you have, as Mohamed mentioned, or Professor Ghumrawi, you had the 2 temples that were so sacred, each lasting for approximately a 400-year period, and then being destroyed by Babylonians and then Romans. But that holy temple was supposed to have the Holy of Holies, or the Holy Ark, or if you think of what's that movie with the Raiders of the Lost Ark, or Finding the Ark, right? So that's some students' association with the Holy Ark. But hundreds of thousands of Jews would make pilgrimages on 3 holidays, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And they'd come and make offerings to the temple. So, of course, that's what Jesus did as a Jew as well during that time. And when it was destroyed, you had an expulsion of not all Jews, but many Jews. And that's where you get kind of the diaspora, and you get the both religious and historical constant yearning for Jews to come back to Jerusalem, right? So that's why, as Professor Ghumrawi mentioned, Jews, religious Jews today, face Jerusalem. They pray 3 times a day in their prayers. They're kind of seeing the importance of Jerusalem and the yearning to go back to Jerusalem. And so many Jewish holidays, you say, like at the end of Pesach and other holidays, next year in Jerusalem, with this yearning to go back to Jerusalem. And in the Torah, or the Hebrew Bible, I think you have over 660 mentions of Jerusalem, its importance, how, what is the phrase? I don't hear that, may your tongue cleave and may your arms be if you forget Jerusalem, right? So a very constant, deep connections in daily prayers and how you face. So Jerusalem for Jews has always been and remains the number 1 holiest place for Jews. And if you look at where Jews pray today, it's the Western Wall or Wailing Wall, but it's the retaining wall of that old temple. And if you look at the Temple Mount, is where the temples used to be, right? And that's where also all 3 religions believe that Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac, right, on the Temple Mount, right? And that's what the basis is. So for Jews, the holiest of holies, in some sense, is still there in some ways, even without the temple being there in that space. And now you have 2 beautiful mosques there, right? One you all recognize with the golden dome that Jordan kind of contributed to covering with gold and so forth. That's very recognizable. So you have people kind of crying, praying at this Wailing Wall, where they feel the connection, the only remnant to where the ancient temples were. And so I'm trying to shift to different things that I'd like to talk about. And so historically, there's also a sense at different periods of history where Jews had sovereignty there, where they'd make pilgrimages there, and other periods of history during the Byzantine and other periods where Jews were expelled and couldn't live in Jerusalem. Other periods where there was relative, better situation. But then when Jordan controlled it from 1948 to 1967, no Jews anywhere in the world, and certainly no Israeli Jews, were allowed to enter the Old City, enter the Jewish quarter of the Old City, or pray at the western or retaining wall to the Old City. And so that, for religious expression, was completely limited to it. I'm saying that because I'm going to talk at the end of my 15 minutes a little bit about visions for the future, right? And so, I've always deeply believed my whole life in a two-state solution where both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, can express self-determination. And one part of that would be Israel conceding most of East Jerusalem and then figuring out what happens in the Old City, and Israel keeping the Jewish quarter and the Western Wall. But one of the reasons there's this concern, not only looking at today of what could happen if someone else controlled it, I'm not saying I think those risks can be maintained and that eventually is going to need to happen, but one has to understand the fears that if someone else controls it, or even, what are the risks of what could happen given the history, just to understand kind of politically how those things play out. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my own kind of personal feelings, to give it more of a personal touch. So I just love Jerusalem. It's incredible. If you've never been there, you have to go. Maybe not today, but you have to go. And we have, by the way, these studies abroad programs that go there that provide full scholarships for program fees and your flights and everything. So still, when things calm down, and they will, something you do. And I know that Professor Ghumrawi also takes students as well. So gorgeous, interesting, fascinating city. I mean, you hear partially because it's important to Christians, Muslims, and Jews, but I love hearing the church bells, the beautiful calls to prayer for Muslim prayers, the diversity and connections for Jews. I mean, you just see, and when you take students to all these religious sites of these different religions, you see people crying, at these different sites, how meaningful it is for them. Millions of pilgrims going in. The beautiful limestone everywhere. It's all limestone. Everywhere you go, there's history. There's connections to Jewish history that are constantly archaeological finds about different periods of history. So I have ancient coins that I wear as jewelry from Jewish sovereignty that are found there at that period. But there's all, like, every step you take, there's history involved there, and you're connected to history. So when I was there in 9th grade, I was also on the cross-country team, and so we'd run through every single neighborhood and park and get to know it, and I loved it. And we didn't have a car, so we took, every Saturday walks to every quarter of the city. For the Old City, you can walk on the old Ottoman walls, you can walk on the roofs of buildings, you can go to all the religious sites. I mean, you could spend years in Jerusalem walking every step, and it's always interesting and fascinating and diverse, and so many different subcultures and cultures. It's amazing, amazing place. Have I said that I love Jerusalem? And so then, that being said, there are obviously real tensions in the city, and it's not some kind of utopia vision of everything. So I think on one hand, it is an open city, and when you go there, you see lots of people praying and people coming from different countries to pray at the sites. There are restrictions when there are security issues, unfortunately, that sometimes bar people at times, or different groups of people from the West Bank. So and we can talk about that are impinges on freedom. But there's also, when you go there, you see lots of people praying in different periods in the city. But there are tensions. There are tensions within the Jewish community between ultra-Orthodox and secular people, and what life should be like during that. There are obviously tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, where the vast majority of West Jerusalem within the 67 borders is Jewish, and the majority of East Jerusalem outside of the 67 borders is Palestinian, although you have some Jewish neighborhoods that have been there for 100 years and more. And so in a sense, it's still a divided city, and like in some ways, like many cities in the world, including some cities in Michigan, I think Michigan is one of the most segregated states in the country, actually, along many lines. In many cities, people are living alongside each other, but not necessarily, going to the same schools or interacting and so forth. And so you see that part of Jerusalem that also exists in other cities, but you also see beyond that as well that there are much deeper tensions. And so, as Professor Ghumrawi said, many of the Palestinians in East Jerusalem are not citizens of Israel. They didn't, at some points, they often had choices to become citizens, and they didn't want to legitimize Israeli rule and chose not to become citizens, and maybe not to participate in elections, municipal elections, because that would give legitimacy. But then sometimes there are drawbacks if you don't participate in elections. You don't get as many resources for your community, so you have deep inequalities. And then given the larger war, in Palestinian territories, emerging Palestine, West Bank and Gaza and so forth, that spill over into this during the Second Intifada, when 1,000 Israeli civilians, mostly civilians, were killed. And this is when the pretty Jerusalem becomes darker, where almost every corner now there's flowers of sites of buses that were blown up, restaurants that were blown up, a cafeteria in the university was blown up. And so I think in terms of the American population, that would be about 40,000 people over a 5-year period. And then if you look at the Palestinian suffering and Israeli reactions to try to prevent or stop, and then the civilians that get caught in that as well, it was over 3,000 Palestinians, which would be like 100,000 Americans, right? So that's the deep pain that already existed in these communities from 2000 to 2005, where every Israeli and every Palestinian, I think, knows someone that was killed in the Second Intifada. Now, if you look at it in terms of just what happened on Saturday, you're talking about 1,000 people over a 5-year period. This was that number in less than a 48-hour period, right? And so that's part of the trauma that people have to understand as well. But as a reaction to that, Israel built this, what they call security barrier, other people call it separation barrier, other call it separation wall. There are politics to what you call it. Over 90% is a fence, but you have these ugly, gray, long walls that most Israelis feel like really did stop the suicide bombings, but then politics went into it as to where it was built, and it was built into 10% of the West Bank, which was taking territory. So if you look at the International Criminal Court, every country around the world is allowed to build a fence or a wall, but they have to build it at an agreed upon border. And so Israel felt like it needed it for its security, but it didn't put it an agreed upon border, and that's part of the contention and negotiation. When we'd go there with our kids would call it the sad wall, and it is a sad wall. And that's just one symbolic difference of what's going on. Yet, also contributed to saving lives, but also having humanitarian impacts on the Palestinian side in terms of where you can go, travel, restrictions, ways of life, communities, and so forth. So again, a complex story, but those are the hardships of Jerusalem. Very, very quickly, in a couple minutes, there's been so many negotiations over what you do with Jerusalem in a future negotiation. So I think Bill Clinton, in his Clinton parameters, had a beautiful trade-off. You can decide it's much easier, and they came very close to where the border should be. There were like 4% differences in terms of where the border would be between Israel and Palestine. What's much more difficult is the emotional and identity issues of Jerusalem and refugees, right? The Palestinian refugees, where will they go? What will happen with them? Jerusalem, now Israel controls all of Jerusalem. What will happen with Jerusalem when Palestinians understandably also want Al-Quds as their capital? And he basically, in my mind, had a trade-off. Okay, Israel, as much as Jerusalem means to you, you're going to concede most of East Jerusalem to a Palestinian state. Palestine, as much as refugees are part and important to you, will define the implementation of return primarily to the new Palestinian state with agreed upon, like even in the Saudi peace plan, it's agreed upon by Israel how many would return to Israel. So it's limited implementation of return. So each people is making a sacrifice into things that are quite integral to their identities and histories. Not everybody loves this idea, but it's a creative kind of compromise. And so I think in the offer of Olmert in 2008, and you can argue about what happened, what didn't happen, etc. But the gist of it in some previous Israeli governments, which I fully support, is to concede most of East Jerusalem. And then you could think of creative ways of dividing or sharing Jerusalem in terms of sovereignty. Maybe Palestine would have sovereignty over the Muslim and Christian quarters. Israel would have sovereignty over the Jewish quarters and Jewish neighborhoods, and then swap what it kept. Or there might be other connections and ways of doing things under a confederation that would allow it to share more. It's too complex to get into, but I think a creative way to deal with this is there on the table, and some governments have talked about it and offered it. You could talk about it in different ways. That had needed further negotiation, and it wasn't like take it or leave it, or there's all kinds of things going on with that. That being said, the current Israeli government is not, putting that on the table and or offering that. So there's so much more to say, but my time's up, and so you get little hints of Jewish connections, personal connections, and future possibilities and scenarios. Yeah, Professor Sarsar.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Aronoff, for inviting us, Dr. Weiss for hosting us today, Dr. Ghumrawi, and I want to also acknowledge my mentor and friend, Professor Dr. Myron Aronoff. We've known each other for at least 45 years. It's tremendous to be with you. My remarks this afternoon focus on the Christian community, but I want to enlarge it a little bit later to talk about my connection to the city. I'm proud to say I was born and raised there. I was born on the Mount of Olives at Augusta Victoria Hospital. I lived my entire life in a section of Jerusalem called Abu Tor. On one side was the Jewish community, on the other side was a Muslim community. And as a Christian, was a minority of a minority living in a Muslim quarter, and I went to Christian schools and lived with Muslim neighbors on one hand. After 1967, there were Jewish neighbors on the other hand. So I experienced all of those communities and memories and recollections. So in speaking about the Palestinian Christian community, I would like to share with you just some basic details to say Palestinian Christians, like many other Christians, consider Jerusalem as the holiest city and the center of their faith. Making the location of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, it is the source of their meaning in life and their salvation. Palestinians and other Christians in Jerusalem reside mostly in the Christian, Muslim, and Armenian quarters, which, by the way, these are inventions of the British Mandate as opposed to having been there many years earlier. They're created by the British. So Jerusalem is divided into 4 major quarters: the Christian, Muslim, Armenian, and Jewish quarters. But also Christians live outside the old city in places like Bet Hanina, Sheikh Jarrah, Wadi Joz, El Tur, Bet Safafa. And they belong to no less than 20 religious sects or denominations that are part of 4 major ethno-religious communities or communions, especially the Latins, the Orthodox, the Monophysites, and the Protestants. And 13 traditional churches are recognized by the civil authorities. Not all of them are. There are maybe 20 denominations, but only 13 are recognized. These are the ones that are recognized to approve baptisms, inheritance, death certificates, and other things. So it's all going through the churches. In Jerusalem, Palestinian Christians and others who identify as Christian number around 19,000 out of 970,000 inhabitants of the city, which is around 2%. The remaining population consists of 34% of Palestinian Muslims and 64% of Israeli Jews. Now, the churches play a very important role, and their influence emanates from attending to the faithful, caring for the holy sites, owning large property. The faithful, while enjoying high levels of education and a higher standard of living than others, remain caught in the net of the same difficulties, political dilemmas, and socio-economic pressures that are peculiar to the region. One major crisis is affordable housing, and it's true of the Muslim community and the Jewish community. Another is immigration, which is the most important for the Christian immigration. Among the main reasons for immigrating are unemployment and the need to find work opportunities, the bad political environment, tough living conditions, and the wish to join relatives who live elsewhere, and obviously, like myself, to pursue higher education. Over 600 Christians leave Jerusalem and its environs every year. Based on the current exodus, it is projected that within 50 years, the Christian presence would cause to exist in the Holy Land. It will be made of Christian museums with very few of the faithful living there. Now, an important element of the Christian community includes the patriarchs and heads of churches. What do they stand, or where do they stand on these issues? Over the years, the patriarchs and heads of churches in Jerusalem have shared their collective views on Jerusalem, especially the need for reconciliation and harmony among people, whether citizens, pilgrims, or visitors. They fully recognize that Jerusalem is a city holy for the people of the three monotheistic religions. However, because of its symbolic and emotive value, Jerusalem has been a rallying cry for exclusivists, nationalists, and fundamentalists. Instead of a place of understanding and accord, the city has become a source of conflict and disharmony. Israel declares Jerusalem as its unified and eternal capital, and Palestine insists on East Jerusalem to become the capital of a future sovereign state of Palestine. The patriarchs and heads of churches add by saying, every exclusivity or every human supremacy is against the prophetic character of Jerusalem. Its universal vocation and appeal lead to it being a city of peace and harmony among all who dwell therein. Hence, Jerusalem should be open to all, shared by all. Those who govern the city should make it the capital of humankind. For the inhabitants of Jerusalem, their city is not only holy, it is also a place where they live, whence they must have rights that enable them to be at home, to be free, and to be at peace with one another. In this regard, the Holy Land, the Jerusalem Peace Institute, of which I'm one of its members, has developed basic principles on Jerusalem, and these present themselves no matter which ruling authority is in control. It doesn't matter if it is Israel, Jordan, Martians coming from out of sea, it doesn't really matter. What are these seven principles? And I love the number 7. It's a perfect biblical number, and I have 7 in a lot of stuff I do for some reason. So it tells you what's my favorite number. Number 1, Jerusalem is the epicenter of the world with unique meanings to both Palestinians and Israelis. Number 2, Jerusalem, especially its old city, is significant to the three monotheistic traditions. The holy places can be managed with input from their representatives. The rights of access to the holy sites and of worship must be accorded to all people. Number 3, Jerusalem should be open, shared, and undivided, serving as the capital of two states, Israel and Palestine. Its security can be maintained through cooperative and coordinated arrangements between them. And that's, by the way, repeated in confederation plans that we are working on. Jerusalem's inhabitants are entitled to fundamental human rights and full protection under the law. They deserve to live a dignified life and to have access to their daily needs. Number 5, Jerusalem belongs to all its inhabitants equally. No ethnic, national, or religious group can be advantaged or favored in the city. Jerusalem's true spirit shines when a culture of diversity and pluralism is actualized, when its inhabitants feel respected, supported, and valued. Number 7, Jerusalem with equitable, impartial, and peaceful relations facilitate resolution of other issues of contention and advances the development of community and a common future. These are the ideals. Even if we approximate or approach 50% of them, will be far better than we are today. So the call for inclusion is best expressed in the vision of a mentor of mine who used to be my high school teacher, who eventually became an established theologian in Palestine and beyond. His name is Rafiq Khouri. I invited him to contribute to the series of books on Jerusalem. He wrote an article called What Jerusalem Has Taught Me, or Jerusalem Has Taught Me. And I have 7 of his elements. He has 18 of them, and 18 is a perfect Jewish number. But I will quote only very quickly 7 of them. He says, Jerusalem has taught me to reconcile myself with my own memory without denying the memory of the other, to be attached to my holy places without excluding the holy places of the others. Jerusalem has taught me even to consider the holy places of the others as my own holy places and the feasts of the others as my own feasts. Number 2, Jerusalem has taught me that my identity is not closed but open, and it is only completed if it is enriched by the identity of the other. Number 3, Jerusalem has taught me to enlarge the spaces of my conscience to become universal without any borders and walls. Number 4, Jerusalem has taught me that the relation with the other is decisive to build up my humanity. Number 5, Jerusalem has taught me to transform walls into bridges. Number 6, Jerusalem has taught me that God is my way to humanity and humanity is my way to God. Number 7, Jerusalem has taught me that the triangle that shapes our human identity is God, myself, and the other, talking of Martin Buber. The 3 parts of this triangle are linked organically with each other. To aggress against one is to aggress against them all. I do not exist without the other, and neither of us exists without God. So this is such a vision that can be actualized. It's very near to us. It's around the corner. We just need to reach out and grab it. Now, what's my own view to conclude my remarks? My own view is that even though Christianity has enfolded me in her arms, from early age I became fully aware of the other in my daily life, mainly the Arab, Palestinian Muslim, and the Israeli Jew. In time, I began to acknowledge, appreciate, and understand the sacredness of Jerusalem to the other 2 Abrahamic faiths of Islam and Judaism, and the importance of Jerusalem to both the Palestinian and Israeli national communities. Exclusive religious and national views soon gave way to inclusive values that embrace both the different and the similar in the other. As a Christian, I can no longer think of Jerusalem without its Muslim and Jewish believers. The wall, the tomb, the rock, all 3 are symbols of faith, faith in the one God. I can no longer think of Jerusalem without its Palestinian people, Christian and Muslim, and without its Israeli Jewish people. Both national communities have rights and claims that must be addressed. Jerusalem is my home. It is also our home. As a Christian, I feel at home in Jerusalem only when I know that my neighbors, my friends, broadly defined, are also feeling at home. For those who advocate hating of the other, and we've just seen it this weekend, and more so, Jesus offers an alternative. Quote, Matthew 5, You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. A similar sentiment was echoed by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In one of his favorite sermons, Loving Your Enemies, he elaborated on Jesus' exhortation to love one's enemies. He believed this command to be an absolute necessity for our survival, and that love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. Otherwise, returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. In conclusion, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, Palestinians and Israelis will be better off if the invitation to nonviolence and peace is taken seriously. And I'll end with a short poem called Jerusalem Why? Jerusalem Why? Are you God's city or humanity's home? Prophets have walked your paths, their fragrance penetrates our soul. Aggressors, fanatics have sought your hand, their arms pollute our air, our shoal. Destroyed twice, besieged 23 times, attacked 52 times, captured, recaptured 44 times. Why? Is it the imprint under your dome? Is it the crimson light or your gold, silver, and chrome? Is it your natural beauty or your scented oil? Is it the garden flowers or the wicked roots in our soil? When will the mind be softened from its rage? When will the dove be released from its cage? We have touched your rock, your tomb, and your wall, all cold stone. Our lips shiver but are warm. Our voices tremble, but we can reform. Our hearts flutter, but we can transform. It's now our duty to perform. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I forgot to mention the Professor Sarsar is also an accomplished poet, as you can see, and he likes to end things with a very, it's a wonderful way to end, bring closure to a panel. So we welcome all questions on anything that was mentioned during the panel, and anything else, in terms of current things that you're feeling and want to share. So it's a safe space. You can really ask anything, express anything, obviously as long as you do it respectfully, which has always been the case here. So we welcome. Don't feel shy. Yeah. Go ahead.
Would you say that most Israelis and Palestinians are in favor of a two-state solution?
So maybe we'll each quickly give an answer to that. So I've looked at a lot of, in the co-edited book that we did, I wrote a chapter on the legitimacy of the two-state solution. And looking at that has been the primary framework since 1993 in the Oslo process, which at many periods throughout most of time, the majority of Israelis, at smaller periods, the majority of Palestinians, but often a plurality of Palestinians, all supported relative to alternatives. But given the last 10 years of stagnation in the peace process and continued cycles of violence, there's been even greater disillusionment among both Israelis and Palestinians about that eventuality happening, as each has great trust for the other. So certain polls have also showed, yes, I'd be willing to do it, but they're not willing to do it, and therefore it's not happening, that kind of thing. So that certainly has really, you see a decrease in support for the two-state solution, often among younger generations, as we talked about in one of our classes today as well. On the other hand, I haven't looked at like this month's poll, But in more recent polls, that I've seen, it still was often, even though it's decreasing relative to each of the alternatives, you still had more people favoring that. And certainly the regional, most of the region, the EU, the UN, the Palestinian Authority, and Fatah, the United States, they still all support a two-state solution, as does the Saudi plan. But every time you have cycles in violence, it becomes more difficult. Yet we're all optimists, I think, to various degrees, that you could configure changes of circumstances, leaders at different times, different regional actors that can step in, that often people aren't willing to concede something because they don't think an agreement's going to happen. But if they see it's happening, and there's grassroots peace building and other things going on, that maybe that confidence or disillusionment can change. It's not static. This weekend's events certainly don't help it. Please, go ahead and.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Dr. Aronoff mentioned, the official position of most governments, as well as the PLO and Palestinian Authority, has been the two-state solution. And you've sort of seen this idea since the Oslo Accords. But unfortunately, if we look at the reality, and over the last 30 years, there's been no real progress towards achieving a two-state solution. Additionally, you're seeing facts on the ground change. And this is making the reality of getting to a two-state solution even more difficult, right? So when Dr. Aronoff mentioned the building of the wall, how it kind of goes inside of the West Bank rather than on the 67 borders, the continued settlement expansion that's happening in the West Bank, which makes things even more difficult, checkpoints, roads. So I think when you juxtapose the reality on the ground versus the idea of a two-state, it becomes much more complicated. Now, as I mentioned, as we talked about a bit in the class before, and I have no official surveys of this. This isn't any official position. But one of the things I have noticed as I travel to Palestine more and more, and I speak with sort of younger generation Palestinians, you can see that they've become so frustrated with the peace process. They've lost all hope that a two-state solution would come into reality. And so you're starting to see more young Palestinians open to the idea of confederation type style solutions, binational state solutions. I know that you guys have written on a confederation style, so there's different ideas floated out there, but I think ultimately, or at least for now, the official position of most world governments, the United Nations, things like that, has been the two-state, but we'll see how that progresses, especially in recent days.
They did their job. They answered. What options do we have? It's one state, two states, three states. Ultimately, it's what human dignity can we put forward? What justice can we put forward? How can we make Israelis feel secure? How can we make Palestinians feel secure and work together? I'm in favor of a two-state solution worked within the confederation model, whereby there are two independent states living side by side in peace, security, prosperity, and then to collaborate on issues common to them, such as transportation, tourism, energy, education, on, and they can buy into it more or they can buy into it less. At the end, it's how do you make people's lives secure, dignified, better than yesterday. And that's a big challenge. And it's not enough to talk about it. Leaders have to step up and to take the risk for peace and to say, we want to do it once and for all. We spoke during the day and we gave several examples about President Anwar Sadat of Egypt, who initiated a war against Israel to recoup what was lost in '67. He collaborated with the Syrians to do that. Yet, 2 years later, he fought for peace In 1977, he visited Israel, signed the Camp David Accord in 78, the Israel-Egypt peace treaty in 79, but he paid for it with his own life. The same of other leaders, whether it is Abdullah I or Ishaq Rabin of Israel, being assassinated by extremists. Extremists are a minority, but we hear about them a great deal because of what they do. We need to start amplifying the voice of moderation. And what we have done on this panel, without us even discussing it, is a voice of moderation. We say enough is enough. We need to move forward to bring peace, harmony, security to the people of the Holy Land. And we want to really make the Holy Land holy as opposed to unholy, which just happened, as you know.
Any other questions?
So I'm an anthropology student, and so I remember reading about there was like some like controversial like construction that was going around Temple Mount, and then when like archaeologists like went through the rubble, they found artifacts from all three faiths, but then it caused like this like weird like I don't know, like academic divisiveness that was going on between that. And I remember like reading that and like thinking it was like kind of strange. Like I guess my question is like, why do you like think that there's this level like sometimes like academic divisiveness around like history projects, archaeological projects, when it's yielding results that would benefit it's like that would, I guess, that would I don't think how to word this, that's yielding results that reflective of all three faiths. Like what's the political tension that's preventing like a more unified like archaeological and historical like academic from like all three faiths. So it's, I thought that was weird. Like I saw, there's like Islamic, you have Islamic artifacts, Christian artifacts, and Jewish artifacts, but yet they're very like divisive still. So
I can quickly, make a stab, then everyone can think a stab, and then you guys go first later, depending on the question or what have you. So, as you might imagine, when you have conflicting claims, and I think all three of us agree, and that's part of what I think is enlightening about this panel, is it's, often people are thinking of either or frames, either this nation has legitimacy or that nation has legitimacy claims, or this religion has legitimate claims or that, and we're saying no. There are, everyone has legitimate claims of different kinds, but when there's a conflict and people don't want to allow legitimacy for another claim, then they may also deny or don't want to find archaeological evidence that would support one claim. So certainly in Israel, there's a real emphasis on archaeology, partly because of the genuine interest in it, and partially because everywhere you look, it adds legitimacy to their indigeneity to this area, right? And their history and claims. And the same, they're Christian, as you mentioned, all three you can find archaeological evidence of different periods overlapping, and that can be a beautiful thing. But because it's contested, by the way, in the Old City, as we all know, like if there's a ladder on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that's been there for 150 years. Basically, people don't want to touch anything.
Yep.
That's every thing has to stay exactly like it is. So that's part of the resistance to archaeological digs. Now it's to such an extent that I think, was it during the Camp David negotiations, or was it Taba, that Israel was contemplating saying, okay, you can have Haram al-Sharif or Temple Mount in Al-Quds, but you can't dig below it, right? Because if you dig below it, then you're going to mess with our Holy of Holies that's there. So there are all kinds of claims there. And also when I took students with an archaeologist to these things, there are also sometimes on Haram al-Sharif or Temple Mount that some of the archaeological evidence that for Jewish claims is swept away for national reasons. So you do have the conflict, the national conflict, emerge over whether you want to find it, whether you want to claim it, whether you reject the others' archaeological history for their claims because you want to show sole legitimacy as opposed to what we've been discussing here. So that would be one answer. I don't know.
Yeah. I think you've answered.
I think that's a great answer. And to your point, it just goes to show, because these artifacts from these three different religions are found there, it really emphasizes the importance of this city to all three.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate the answer. And I think it's also like kind of hopeful and maybe like be a time when it's not like so divisive, because a lot of like these things are included in all the religious texts, they have like so. Yeah.
Could I just make a footnote to this as an anthropologist? Academic politics and divisiveness is universal, even divorced from all the religious, historical stuff. So you get a couple of archaeologists together, they're going to disagree about findings, and that's on top of all the stuff that we're discussing here. It's just part of the nature of the beast.
I had a question. I know that the Jewish quarter has been extensively changed in the last 70 years. But what about the other parts of the old city? How much have they changed, for instance, since 1900 or 1800? Because what's amazing to me, I've seen lots of ruins of all different ages all over the world, is that Jerusalem has been continuously occupied. It's never been a ruin. So I'm wondering, how much has the other part of the old city changed?
I think, Saliba, you might know the most about this, but if you look at, I know from after 1967, you had the Moroccan quarter, as they refer to it, cleared out, and this created the space that you see now in front of the Western Wall. But there's also this sanctimonious sort of approach of keeping the city the way it is. As you mentioned, right, this has never become an ancient city. It's always been a fought after or sought after piece of land or territory, and it's been continually inhabited through centuries. And so I think that's my take on it. You've seen renovations in some of the holy places, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, even on the Temple Mount, in terms of the building of Al-Aqsa throughout the centuries, and the Dome of the Rock throughout the centuries, have also seen renovations undertaken. But maybe Saliba can talk more to it.
Yeah. The quarters, as I mentioned before, are an invention of the British Mandate. Today, and since '67, you see more Jewish people moving into, obviously, the Jewish quarter, but also some into the Muslim quarter, into the Christian, into the Armenian quarter. The churches control a lot of the Christian quarter properties. In the old days, and this might not answer directly what you're asking, but in the old days, for families, in order not to pay taxes to the Ottoman Empire, they used to endow their home to the church, and then the church will look after it while they're living there. Now the church is reclaiming its property from them and asking them to pay monthly rent. And this creates a lot of disaffection. And these quarters are not very strictly demarcated. In other words, there are Muslims who live in the Christian quarter, Christians who live in the Muslim quarter. I don't believe Christians or Muslims live in the Jewish quarter. They might be on the outskirts of there. Now there are efforts for some hotels and so on to be built on property of the Armenian quarter, which is the tiniest, which is creating a lot of disaffection. Also, some Christians are very angry at their own church leaders, especially among the Orthodox or the Armenians, who they believe sold property to Jewish entrepreneurs. So there is movement, but it's taking time, and it's not as evident to the eye when you go to tour the city and so on.
Question in the back.
stand up so that you guys can see this. Vertically challenged. I've taken students to Jerusalem 6 times in the last 8 years. I do the study. I've done the study abroad for MSU on a pretty regular basis. And one of the things that students learn about Jerusalem is that even though people all live in Jerusalem, that doesn't mean that they actually live together. They don't really like each other, generally. They don't really interact with each other. Even if they're, let's say, ultra-Orthodox Jews and secular Jews, there's very little interactions between the communities. If you're Christian Arab in East Jerusalem or in the Old City, there might be daily interactions with Muslim Arabs in the Old City, but maybe not so much with the Jews. And even if there are interactions between, it's very rare for somebody from a Christian family to marry somebody from a Muslim family, and vice versa. There is a sense in the city generally of segregation, that communities are too afraid of being exposed to the other community, and for their people to lose something of their religious identity, national identity, by having meaningful relationships with each other. And so, since we got 3 religious perspectives, from a Jewish religion perspective, Muslim religion perspective, a Christian religion perspective here, what I'd like to, because there's a romanticism of that and a love of that and an appreciation of that when people think about Jerusalem, people relate to Jerusalem. But maybe that is the problem. Isn't the problem the fact that we look at Jerusalem too much from a religious perspective and we don't think about other aspects of living in the city? One of my students, former students in study abroad, and did an internship this year in Israel, in Jerusalem, trying to resolve issues of, for example, where does the sewer flow? Where does the water flow? Who gets the water? Who gets dealing with environmental issues? If you're dealing with an environmental issue, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim Jew or a Christian, or if you're an Orthodox Jew and a secular Jew. It's a problem. And so, isn't it that by emphasizing the religious differences or the religious identity so much, even though we might be able to bridge across them, isn't that becoming the problem instead of the solution?
Want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, you are making a great point that there are divisions internally among the 3, but also internally among each of them. This is, as I mentioned in my piece, this is a living city. People come and go, buy products, go shop for food, for whatever, and they pass each other, they rub elbows against each other, but they do not communicate with each other. Mostly they do for business reasons, but social purposes, they are segregated themselves for multiple reasons. They don't want to normalize, they don't want to intermarry and so on, but there are all these other exceptions. I think what your student is doing in the internship is very important. We need to look at transportation, at education, at housing, on and on. And also the municipality has an important role to play in investing in developing Jerusalem in multiple ways and doing it fairly for the Jewish side as well as for the Arab side, which has been an issue for many. So it's a combination. It cannot only be looked at from a religious point of view, but we've heard from the archaeological point of view, the social point of view, the cultural point of view, and that's what makes it interesting. But ultimately, it is significant and it is symbolically so for the people who live there, for people looking from the outside on it. And our message is one of peace, to say, wake up. It cannot be the exclusive domain of any. It has to be the inclusive domain of all. And we need to think of it as humanity's gift as opposed to a gift for one versus the other.
I would just add really quickly, I think it's a great question, Yael, Professor Kedem, because in a way we are romanticizing a little bit the this, as you say. Alan Dowdy has a book, Israel Palestine, that I use in classes where he has Palestinian-Israeli narratives and then shows different stages of the conflict. And I think, and he does as well, that it's primarily a nationalist conflict. Like people say, oh, is it a conflict between different religions? But it's primarily two nationalisms that were solidified at a similar time that are vying, right, for self-determination in the same territory in terms of the base of a conflict that's playing out. Now, alluding to what you're saying, he looks at a kind of religious stage of the conflict, which makes things more difficult, right? Which is kind of also what you're getting at, that religion can also, or religiosity and the religious connections to something can also work to inflame the conflict and obstruct trying to find a solution as well. So there are potential negative impacts depending on the interpretations of the religion and so forth as to whether that actually fosters a resolution of a conflict or can act as obstructive. So I don't know if that's what exactly you are getting at, but it certainly can have in different parts of the communities a more obstructive kind of impact in terms of being able to resolve this peacefully.
So obviously after this past weekend, we've seen a vast increase in media coverage of the area, but just looking at this past weekend and other past conflicts in the area, I just wonder your general thoughts on how the media portrays the conflicts in the area, whether they do it well, or obviously it's such a nuanced and complicated area, and how we can expect the media to properly inform the general public, in their 2-minute news bite that they might have. How can they portray the various sides of the issue, just to inform the public better on what's actually going on? Because I think there's so much disinformation and just lack of education with most people on what the actual dynamics of these conflicts are.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think what you're seeing now is really this this fight of dual narratives, and how this is received in certain parts of the world is of course different, right? Here in the West, especially in the U.S., I think it's safe to say there's slightly of an Israeli tilt in how this coverage or media coverage is covered. But ultimately, look, you can't take all your news from just the media. You especially can't take your news from social media. So you guys have to also be careful, as young people who I know are on social media. But what you're seeing now is really a fight of two narratives, both vying for your attention, right? This is the plight of the Palestinians. They've been under occupation for decades. Gaza has been under a siege for a decade. Versus, Israel that has the right to defend itself, Israeli citizens that were killed by, Hamas, this terrorist organization. And so, I've always told my students, ultimately, because they always say, well, and even now, over the last few days, I get these messages, where can I go for the most unbiased media, right? And of course, there's certain news outlets that may be more unbiased than others, but I think ultimately, no matter what media news outlet you follow, there's always going to be a bias. No matter what. This is why media outlets exist, right? There's always some sort of underlying message that they are trying to spread to their audience. So what I do, I think there's multiple things. The first is watch as much media as you can and as much different media news outlets as you can, right? So from Fox News to CNN to MSNBC to NPR, always take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt as you watch these different media outlets and get your news, and even from social media, right? I think the idea is to encompass all of that information that you get and then try to form your own opinion as best you can. And then ultimately, if you really care about this subject and you care about this topic, to do your own research. I shared with the panel today earlier, I said I've had friends who have reached out to me and family even who have reached out to me over the last few days and have said, well, can you recommend one or two books that is really good? I want to learn more about this topic. And, me and Saliba, we sort of chuckled because the idea that you think you could read one or two books and all of a sudden become an expert or get a grasp on this topic. It's one that's rooted deep with a history. But I will say this. If your starting point to this conflict, or at least if your starting point to what has happened over the last few days is Saturday and the attacks by Hamas on Israelis, then I think your analysis is going to already be flawed in that sense, because there's a deeper history into understanding what has taken place over the last few days. And so you really have to sort of acquaint yourself with that history to get a deeper understanding of what's taken place. And unfortunately, I think the reality is it's going to continue to get worse before it gets any better.
I just want to add a little bit to that. I think it's a fantastic and pertinent question, and we agree about the dangers of social media and the inaccuracies of what might be portrayed, the dehumanization of one kind or other that is happening in social media. And you have to remember, I think we all have to remember, when you're forwarding something or liking something, stop and ask yourself, is this a credible source? And is the message causing harm to other members of our community and a different kind? And that's maybe something to think about, and absolutely look at a bunch of different sources and take classes if you want to learn more. It's not just a book. We have so many classes that we offer here at MSU that can give you a deeper and better understanding. So hopefully if you want to learn more, you do that. And I also think it's really interesting because we all see the news and see different biases in it. So for instance, for myself, I see increasing bias even in the New York Times, which is a very credible source, and in CNN, when, in one of our classes, we're looking at the 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021 wars. And in many of those wars, what I'd see depictions of is you see Israeli soldiers, and you'd see Palestinian civilians. And it was like, if you just look at the images, it's like often portrayed as brutal soldiers killing what Hamas is orchestrating, only showing civilians who've been killed, not showing the militants that were killed, because they censor what can be done from it. So that doesn't mean that it's really important to see the civilians. We're all about the pain of civilians, and it's an important part of the story. But what you have to realize is in a lot of these media outlets, you're getting part of the story, you're getting part of the images, but not all. And what narrative is that being shown? So I mentioned at a meeting yesterday that there's a book by Dana Horn on Everybody Loves Dead Jews, right? So I think the portrayal in many of these situations was, even though Israelis are suffering from PTSD and have 15 seconds to go to a bomb shelter where 5,000 rockets are hitting at them with intention to kill them, well, they haven't killed them. They have the protection of the Iron Dome. They have a bomb shelter. So hey, why do they have to defend themselves? Why are they fearful? And we'd never, ever, ever see images of children in bomb shelters, interviewing civilians in bomb shelters, because they didn't die. Now, all of a sudden, on CNN, they're covering Israeli civilians. Why? Because they're dead. And you have 260 people your age who were slaughtered and massacred intentionally in a peace music festival, right? And you're seeing that. Why? Because they died. And when they don't die, they don't exist. So I think we can all come at these different, we all see different things in the coverages in terms of what's being left out. And what part of the story is being told and what other part is not being told. And so I think what you have to do, I think it's incumbent on all of us, is to realize that we don't want to look at part of it. Like, you can have multiple truths that are true when you're getting partial information, but you want to recognize sometimes that's part of the information, what's missing, and think critically in terms of looking at multiple sources, credible sources, learning more about it. And then you can have many, many, many different points of view that you come up with based on that. but realizing, am I getting partial information? What is the narrative that's being told? And often the images really selectively show a particular or part of a story that's being told, and some are biased one way or another, I think.
First, I want to say how proud I am to even be here and have you all honor us with this panel. I think you all four of you are brave in this moment to have this panel, to go through with what you had planned, and it moves me to no end. I just want to just applaud you and say I'm proud to even be here. So thank you. What was my question?
Thank you.
I guess a couple of things. I think the question about the media question is, I think, for our students, a super live one. I think that's one that's causing all sorts of pain and anguish and confusion. The only thing I might add to respond to that is that it seems, as I think about the media landscape, the idea of the dual narrative seems like it's not quite adequate, because you have, maybe those are the core, the two main ingredients, but you have outlets that are either one narrative or the other at the extremes. And then you have media outlets that do seem to try to, in various proportions, acknowledge some mix, some sort of complex truth. And I would say those are the ones I would want to look for, the ones that seem to acknowledge the multifaceted dimensions of these events. My question is about the coexistence in Jerusalem, if I could go back to that. I haven't been in Jerusalem since 2017, unfortunately. At that time, I remember some of us kind of commenting on how, where previously there had been this stark segregation between different elements of the population, that there were some sites that seemed to be emerging as places where suddenly people were starting to come together. Mamila Mall is one, and the Sultan's Pool, that valley that now is kind of a recreational, artistic space. Yeah, and there were fountains, people playing, and I just remember very vividly kind of being like, I'm seeing interactions, not necessarily deep interactions, but somebody said to me, this is now you will see Palestinian women being served by a cashier who is Jewish in the store. And this kind of some sort of possibility of a mixing of populations. That was 2017. If you've been there more recently, I guess I'm asking, has that continued? Has that resegregated? What is going on there?
I think it's still going on at different levels. The beauty which I witnessed many a time in the Liberty Bell gardens,
yes,
with the fountains and so on, children who are Arab and who are Jewish play together, and you look at them, you don't know who is the Jewish, who is the Arab, and that in a sense is so wonderful to watch, and that needs to be encouraged. We talked before in a class about the hand-in-hand school, where students who are Jewish and Arab learn together from Jewish and Arab professors, and that's what we want to put forward and amplify more and more. But it is happening, but I agree with the prior questioner, where this is difficult for many because they don't want to be branded as one or another, so they deal with each other more at the superficial level. But there are very serious relationships going on. I have called my Jewish friends, I've called my Arab friends over the last 2-3 days, and they are part of me. I cannot be without them. And I think many others have done so, but that needs to happen at a larger level, which will take time to materialize. I know we are coming to a close.
Maybe we'll take
one more?
two more questions, and then we'll stick around afterwards as well if there's some questions, even though they've had a very long day. So maybe 3 questions. Let's say 3 questions, and then we'll do it. Maybe go ahead. Yeah.
So this is kind of like a question with like somewhat of an obvious, answer, but I just kind of want you guys' perspectives. So considering, like all these like attacks are happening, and like a lot of people are dying. So do you truly see like a peaceful two-state solution being realistic in, let's say, the next 20 or 30 years? Because I feel like when stuff like this happens, we need to evaluate the fact that, like, you know, you got young people living on both sides. And, like, there's a quote I read, and it was like, wars are the old and the bitter forcing the young and the stupid to kill each other. But when it comes down to, like, these young people who are on both sides and who've seen, you know, their families dying, do you feel like that of course is going to raise, like, the tensions for the future, but do you see like a possible, like, peaceful two-state solution that could, like, be in, like, 20 or 30 years? And if so, like, how could we come about that? Because I know foreign policy also, like, if we're talking in terms of, like, globalization has stuff to do with it, but, like, how could we see that if we can see it in general?
I hope it happens within 5 years as opposed to 25 years. And the groundwork is there. We know what has to happen. We need people, leaders, not only political leaders, but transformational leaders, to be creative, to have goodwill, to negotiate in good faith, and move us forward towards that. But it takes all of us as citizens of both countries to say, this is what we want, and we will not elect you if you do not fulfill this program. And this has to happen, and they will wake up and 25 years from now say, why didn't we do this in 2023? But this did happen. I mentioned the example of Egypt, where Anwar Sadat fought a war and was supportive of leaders before him who have initiated attacks against Israel and so on, yet he saw the light. And we don't need to wait till somebody reaches close to death to say, oh, I told you so. In one of my books, I relate the story of King Hussein of Jordan. In 1967, when I was through that war in Jerusalem, I heard him. His voice was emitting from the minarets of mosques. He say, this is the enemy, go and attack them in whatever you have in hand. Yet in 1999, when he was close on his deathbed, he pleaded with the people meeting with him, who are the leaders of Israel, Palestine, and so on. Don't waste the time. You owe it to your future generations. Have peace. We don't need to wait so long. We can do it. We know what's to happen. How do we make the leaders come and see it? I'm being optimistic, but not, how shall I say, I don't want to be Panglossian, as they say, but we need to force leaders to start thinking in this way, to say, how can we make it happen? They don't have to have the whole loaf. We can have the loaf and do it right. That's how I feel.
And I guess I would add to that, in addition, which we're in full agreement with, that before Oslo, no one thought it would happen. Afterwards, like, oh yes, it was predetermined. No one guessed how the Cold War ended and the timing and nature. And afterwards, oh yes, of course, this was predetermined. There are a lot of things that can change with one leader, one event, a particular consequence of events that then react with each other. And so one of the things can be regional actors and international actors that help these countries that have weak institutions in some ways, that sometimes act as obstacles to reaching peace, to help them make the accommodations that'll be necessary. And one thing that that I was grasping at, even though I knew it wasn't likely, was the process towards normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, if and only if it hinged on kind of a real significant dramatic progress towards a two-state solution between Israel and Palestinians. That would require an accommodation on Israel's parts that would have to lead to a change of government and change of the coalition within the government to allow that to happen. And so I was kind of hoping that could potentially have that effect. And even though Mahmoud Abbas, who I think can be a partner of peace despite his age now and the lack of elections, if he had the backing of a Saudi Arabia to be able to make certain accommodations, that would strengthen his hand in some ways. So that could have, maybe with a different Israeli government now, with a different legitimacy that Mahmoud Abbas would have, to me it's such a missed opportunity if just the arrangements were different on both sides, that they could actually take advantage of it. And I fear that one of the multiple motives that Hamas had for its attacks on Saturday was to harm the progress towards this kind of normalization. And Iran backs Hamas and Islamic Jihad financially with training, with weapons. And Iran is also opposed to the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, or to a two-state solution. So I don't think that was the only motivation. There's multiple motivations, but it was. And so if you see how close it could be with some government, prior Israeli governments could have been able to do it. Mahmoud Abbas is a partner. Different people may be able to do it who succeed him with regional help, with international help. It actually can happen, I agree, before the timeline that you suggest. So we are optimists, but things can change quickly in a negative direction, as we saw this weekend, but also can change quickly in a positive direction. If disillusioned people see that there is a chance. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'll add very quickly because I know we're on a time constraint. But of course, with the events that happened this weekend, I think once things calm, which I hope is quickly, I think if anything to take away from what's happened, it's that the current status quo is unsustainable. And so I think it shows that there's even more of a reason now to reach this peace agreement, or I fear that we'll continue to see spurts of violence like we did see break out this past weekend. And it's ongoing.
Go ahead.
Sort of
Did you have?
No. Go ahead. I want 1 minute at the very end.
Yeah.
Okay.
1 minute.
On the theme of context framing of narratives in the media, I feel there are some major ones that are continually rehashed, I suppose, such as the false equivalency of Judaism and Zionism, and the creation of a false equivalency between critiques of Israel being anti-Semitic inherently, or the attribution of Hamas to all of the Palestinian people, or of even just the historical context that Israel is a modern settler colonial apartheid state with Palestinian people living in an open-air prison in which I believe 40% are under the age of 15. And you spoke about the continued radicalization, of course, of Hamas, but I feel there's also a point to be made about the radicalization of the Israeli government and its shift to fascist right-wing ideologies with figures like Benjamin Netanyahu. So I suppose I just
So let me take a first stab at that. I mean, certainly the current government has real extremist, racist, homophobic, fascist, Ben Gvir and Smotrich especially, who are kind of, I feel like, arsonists who want to set a fire and provoke a fire, and are doing real damage. And by the way, having these people who have never served in the military, in the security cabinet, is a concern, and is probably why partial story of why they may have been surprised. So certainly, Israel has significant major human rights violations inherent in an occupation, and there's no question we have to empathize with the suffering of Palestinians, also in the Gaza Strip, that we have to put ourselves in their shoes, and I don't think any of us would choose to live there. It is an open-air prison in many ways on both the Egyptian and Israeli side. So one definitely has to recognize that and empathize with that and try to understand that. That being said, there can be, with any kind of prejudice, a sense of, is this prejudice, the call or the recognition of is this being misused? Are we calling people racist or Islamophobic or anti-Semitic too often when they're not, right? But with most of the prejudices, first you want to take it seriously. If someone is saying something is Islamophobic or anti-Semitic or racist, your first reaction should be, maybe I should listen. Maybe it is, because it could be misused, it can be abused. But maybe often we want to give the benefit of the doubt to try to keep an open mind as to why someone is feeling from that particular group as that is, right? Now, I think that Israel is criticized all the time, maybe mostly by Israelis themselves, right? If you look at what's been happening in the past 9 months, you have 700,000 Israelis demonstrating twice a week against their government and against the weakening of their democracy and for their democracy. That would be the equivalent of 20 million Americans demonstrating twice a week because they think their democracy is in danger. And they're very different situations, but one can make an argument about the weakening of democracy in this country in different ways. Have we seen 20 million Americans a week doing that? No. So I think who most of all criticizes some Israeli policies and Israeli governments is Israelis themselves. And so all the more reason why I think most Jews are not saying you can't criticize Israel, because most American Jews and many Israeli Jews are constantly criticizing Israeli policies, right? So I think one has to be fair to be like, okay, when does it then cross the border? And there are things that one can look at as to when. So one thing is, are they using anti-Semitic stereotypes, right? Are they saying that Jews are responsible for all the ill in the Middle East? Or are they comparing Israel to some kind of satanic figure in images and in other things, right? That plays into different anti-Semitic stereotypes, and we don't have time to go through all of them, but that's one easy way to see is something cross the line. Another way to cross the line is to deny, right, the historical or religion connections. Just plain deny those things might be another, right? And there are a whole sets of things that if you're interested, I actually encourage all of you to go to our conversations on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And if you really care, not just about the abuse of a prejudice, but the actual prejudice that's been on the rise and actually exists and has been on the rise nationally, globally in Michigan, the local synagogue, there was going to be mass killings in the synagogue in East Lansing, and it was stopped by the FBI. There are things happening that are real, and we don't want to minimize those things. And if you really care about anti-Semitism, and you really care about Islamophobia, and both those things are going to rise right now with this conflict, and that's why you have to be sensitive to both those things on social media, then you want to take those things also seriously. And I encourage you all, we have flyers outside. There's 4 sessions, 2-hour sessions, where Muslim studies faculty, Jewish studies faculty are engaged in dialogue and education about that. So I really encourage, if you want to know more about that, to do that. I also would question that you look at similarities and differences between settler colonialism, and there might be some similarities to settlers, but unlike the United States and most of us here, other than Indian Americans, Native Americans, Indigenous Americans, are immigrants to the society with no prior connection to the United States. As I tried to outline, you can reject it or accept it. There are some indigenous connections of Jews to a country that they mostly came as refugees to, not for a home country that they didn't have to extract resources from, but actually to come back to a country they were indigenous to express those different. That doesn't mean excuse everything that was done. It doesn't mean you have to support it, but you do want to try to understand both the similarities and differences, right, between both regular colonialism that Britain and others engaged in and Israel. And very quickly with apartheid, you can look at the immediate thing that comes to mind is South Africa. And that is based on an ideology of racial superiority. And if you look at some of the organizations like Human Rights Watch that actually say that Israel is apartheid in some ways, they make a significant rationale of saying how different it is from South Africa, that it's not based on that. You have within Israel Palestinians in the Supreme Court, in the coalition government, in the last government, in political parties, etc. That doesn't mean there's not discrimination and equality, there is. But you want to say, okay, if we're using a broader definition of apartheid that deals with broader inequalities, is Israel the only country that fits that label, or does the United States fit that? Does Turkey fit that? Does Morocco fit that? Does other countries around the world fit that in different ways? And that takes the loaded kind of attempt at times to demonize, as opposed to use an academic comparative fashion, the term. And so I think if we use it academically and comparatively, we can have a real great conversation about that. Who fits that? Who doesn't fit that? Why or why not they don't fit that? But one thing to always keep in mind is if it's only Israel that is labeled that way out of the 194 countries, then I think one should always not immediately say, I think often the term, it's not anti-Semitic on many people's part. But if it's the only country that one uses it against, or it's the only people on earth that don't deserve self-determination, then you need to question, oh, why is that? Are we singling it out? If we are singling out, do we have objective criteria by which other countries fall under that as well? So sorry, but that's what I would say to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. To wrap things up, over this weekend with everything that's been going on, I've been seeing a lot of takes on social media that have like the depth and nuance of a kiddie pool, and you know everybody wants to give their opinions, and especially like as somebody who knows like Israelis and Palestinians who are affected by this, you know, seeing people trying to justify either act of violence is incredibly hurtful and disheartening. So I guess you could say, when looking forward to peace, do you feel like I guess both on either side that there is this like belief that you need to eradicate the other group completely that is strong within the nation, or do you think that we can be hopeful for peace and hopefully things like this will die down, at least as far as believing that like one group needs to be completely like eradicated?
We are strong believers in peace, so
Yeah. Fully loaded question, right?
let's keep it short.
I'll keep it short. Look, I think this is about intentions and political will. Ultimately, Hamas governs the Gaza Strip, but this occupation, has existed since 1967. Hamas wasn't created until 87, so almost 20 years. I would argue that, this radicalism is a result of the occupation not being ended more quickly than it should have. So, this drives a younger generation that sort of sees no hope for a future. It was mentioned of Gaza. The majority of the population is young, people. Has one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. And even if you look at things like gang psychology and why people join gangs, why people join terrorist organizations and things like that, a lot of them deal with no economic opportunities or no socioeconomic opportunities. So I think if we are able to resolve the root core of the issues, right? And I don't want to attribute this to different groups. I think it's an ideology, a mentality, right? I mean, saying if we were to wipe out Hamas does not mean we are going to wipe out extremism, not under these conditions. So I think fixing the root core of the issue, which is economic disparity, which is the occupation, which is the living conditions that Palestinians are living under, if we are able to resolve those and find a just and lasting peace where both Palestinians and Israelis can live side by side equally, then I think you'll resolve the root core of the issue. And and it might take a generation, it might take 2 generations. But look, I mean, we have countries in the U.S. that we have fought with. And now we dropped a nuclear weapon on Japan, and now they're one of our closest allies. I don't see why, if we are able to solve the root core of the issues between Palestinians and Israelis, that they will eventually, through a generation or 2, come to, put this in the past and learn to live together peacefully for the future.
I would like not to, I think those answers are excellent. I want to conclude 60 seconds exactly. Somebody
Professor Sarsar, just 2 minutes before your 2 minutes, and I would just answer
60 seconds.
Before your 60 seconds, and thank you for all staying patient. So I agree in some cases absolutely that the suffering and occupation and so forth can breed radicalism, but I also think that it's the extremists on both sides that have often been spoilers. It's not only a reaction, that they have often intentionally spoiled progress towards peace, right? And
Yeah.
so what Hamas's part is they are against occupation, but they don't see occupation as just post-67 borders, and they've actually spoiled in the 90s, starting in the 90s, before any kind of siege of Gaza. They were having increased suicide bombings during the Oslo process and before the 1996 elections, because they didn't want an independent Palestinian state in part of the land. They wanted in all of the land, right? And so it was an either or category. So on one hand, one does have to understand and empathize with supporters for Hamas and why they support it and the horrible conditions of living and the multiple motivations for it. And you have to try to understand that. But simultaneously, I also don't think it's as simplistic as a reaction to current things, because in times of hope, they intentionally spoiled the chances for a two-state solution. And likewise, on the Israeli extremes, as you point out, I mean, I definitely think someone like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich don't have room for the other side, dehumanize the other side, and I fear, support kind of dehumanization and things that could lead to more violence and killings and so forth like that, and even encourage killings by some terrorists in the West Bank of Palestinians. So you have these extremists who are, it's not only like they can have their own grievances, but it's an actual, because they deny the legitimacy of the other side and the humanity of their side, that this continues. And of course you had settlements in Israel that were an obstruction to it, and Netanyahu himself throughout the years has been a contributor to the stagnation of and deterioration of the peace process. So there's so many people involved, but I think often these spoilers intentionally spoil a compromise towards a two-state solution, because extremes will say hang on to a one-state solution in which they're dominant and have the dominant power, and essentially exclude the other in a variety of different ways. And so you see the extremists on both sides often arguing for a one-state solution that generally excludes the other and puts them in power. So I think it's definitely partly of what you're saying that's a motivation, but I also think you have extremists on both sides that are intentionally spoiling a particular kind of solution because they want the whole thing, not part of the thing. Yeah. Part of the. You get the last words.
Oh, thank you. 60 seconds. What laid the groundwork for this panel is really the three books that I have in hand here. I approached Christians to write in a volume that brings Christian, Jews, and Muslims together and say, who else is writing? And then I approached Muslims, who else is writing? I approached Jews, who else is writing? I knew that there was reluctance on the part of authors if they are in one book. So ultimately, I said, never mind. So I have here Christian perspectives and reflections. I have here Muslim perspectives and reflections. And I have Jewish perspectives and reflections. And this really all relate to the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is diversified, it's multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, but all of them live in one city. And now we have 3 volumes that can be put in one single box and become one, just like city is one. And I want the city of Jerusalem to remain one, undivided, capital of 2 states, Israel and Palestine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming, and our heart goes out to you and your different communities that you belong to in these coming days. If you're a student or a faculty, we want to take a picture. We'd like to join a picture with our speakers. You're welcome to come, and we're going to take a picture together.